property that was previously contaminated?
The property was
No,
going
because once it's clean, it's the only thing that
Well-
you have that you would know is clean.
Well, you know, it's funny because it's so funny. That's right. That's like my brother-in-law who said insurance companies love people who just had an accident because the odds are they won't have another one for a long time. You know, it's sort of the same thing. You got to meet my brother-in-law, I'm telling you. But anyway, the thing is, come over next Friday. He's coming over. The thing is this, though. Farmland in the 80s is what we all thought was the answer. And they used to call that virgin property pretty much. That was sort of the expression they used. It was the only time you could use that term in New Jersey. So anyway, the thing was, sorry, you are from Jersey. I should have said that here, I forgot. Anyway, but the thing was, that's what we thought. Then what happened was, in Burlington County, so for those of you who don't know, it's sort of in the mid portion of Jersey, the U.S. Homes, which is a big national home builder, was building some homes on former farmland, and they started doing some soil tests for whatever reason, and they started getting the heavy metals and pesticides and all the things associated with previous farm use. So, for example, if you have apples, if you're growing apples, and we are the Garden State. You knew that when you were flying in and you looked down, you could tell this looks like the Garden State. But we had a lot of orchards here in New Jersey. You need arsenic for orchards for some, you know. So there's a lot of metals associated with former farm use, and there's a lot of pesticide associated with farm use, and there's a lot of fertilizer associated with farm use. That stuff stays there forever. It doesn't go anywhere. So just because you're building houses there doesn't mean the metals and the pesticides and all that stuff goes. The crops, the herbicides, the Marvinicides, all the sides, you know, whatever their first names are, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they all stay there. And what happens is in around 86, 87, 88, this was a disaster, and actually the Department of Environmental Protection had to get involved. And at this development in Burlington County, they had to really do a massive cleanup. But the ironic thing is, it was property that everybody thought was clean, you know, because that was the best property. So we now know in New Jersey that farmland, redevelopment of farmland, is every bit as difficult and problematic as a factory that, you know, had degreases and waste oil and all the things that we always knew was a problem. So there's no free lunch. It doesn't really matter what was going on there. You have to take a look at it. And after you take a look at it, there's a question of whether or not the contamination that may have been addressed has a effect on the value, and that's stigma damages. One other thing I just want to share with you before we get into too much detail on this is that environmental law all over the country is changing. So when I started in the 80s, and anybody know when the modern environmental movement started in this country, by the way? It's all, whatever state it is, it's the same answer. Anybody know?
Earth Day in the 70s.
Thank you very much. Thank you. You're the man. I knew there's always one guy that knows. He's going to be asking all the questions. And he's going to know all the answers to it. I got to watch it. No, but anyway, that's right. It was Earth Day in 1970. Was really the modern, it was the first Earth Day, and all the hippies said, we got to get around. We were those hippies, okay? That was us, remember? We all had our long shoulder-length hair, and we had to have our first Earth Day. With that came the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and across the country, most of their regulatory environmental agencies gave birth around that time. So it really was Earth Day. And you know, that's like the only holiday that Hallmark doesn't have a card for, but it's actually the most important one. And that's really, everything really came, that's a true story, by the way. That's really where they all came from. And, but when the environmental agencies were born in the early 70s, the thesis in terms of cleanup was this: if somebody's contaminated property, every last drop of it has to be removed in order for the agency to give its blessing and say it's, quote, and I'm using air quotes, clean. You know, and that's what it was in the 70s, and that's what it was in the 80s. And in fact, in the 80s, that's why it was a good time to be an environmental lawyer, you see, because the agencies all across the country were relentless, and people needed lawyers because they couldn't deal with the agencies. And that's the way it was back then. In the 90s, across the country, the thesis as to what clean means changed. And clean all over the place. And by the way, half of this is based on science, the other half is based on politics and the economy. And when the economy gets worse, what we consider clean becomes a more liberal standard, you know, and that's the way it is. There's a very indirect relationship. And so we started looking at the idea that you can consider something to be clean even if there's a little stuff left behind, you know. And then the question was, well, how much can be left behind? And the agency started developing regulatory limits as to how much can be left behind and still considered to be safe for residential development. And also, they started determining how much would be safe for non-residential or commercial or industrial, depends on what state you're in, the words they use, development. So living in a house, certain levels would be safe. If you were in a factory or an office building, different levels would be safe. Same stuff, same toxicological consequences, same possibility of cancer and respiratory disease and neurological impairment and whatever in the world it was, but in a house, one level would be okay, and in another house, another level would be okay. Anybody have any idea as to why that might be? Yes, ma'am.
I would think it would have something to do with the paving and how much soil was covered up and exposed to the general public.
Well, that's not the answer as to which levels would be acceptable, but that is the answer as to why in certain settings the contamination may not pose a hazard. That's right. Yes, sir.
I'm going to say it's got to do with children.
And that's partly correct. These are generally health-based standards. And that's, we do a lot of, and it's terrible, and it's the most heartbreaking work that we do, but we do a lot of what we call toxic tort litigation, where people are injured because of contaminants. They get cancer from benzene, or they get neurological disease. We do a lot of that. And it is true, children are not the same as just little people when it comes to this. They really react differently, and the risk to them for so many of these things is really, can be orders of magnitude, right? Because they're developing. Their brains are developing, their bodies are developing, and so the impacts tend to be so much, especially lead. Somebody like me, they could give me all the lead I want. I'm not changing. It doesn't matter. I'm already the way I am. I think you could tell. But for a little child, lead could really be, and we see that in the cities in particular, from all the from all the lead from the buses, that's every place, and the paint. So you're right. Children is one thing, and then there's one other thing. In duration of exposure, you're sleeping in the house. Unless you have a fight with your spouse, you're sleeping in the house, and so when you're there, you have greater exposure. It is true that you work all day in the workplace, but often you might be several floors up in the air. You might be more removed from the contaminants, and so that's why they tend to be different standards. Now, where does this fit in? Well, many times when you're appraising a piece of residential property anywhere, and there's been a cleanup, and by the way, the fancy word for cleanup is site remediation. So if you're ever on Jeopardy or something, right, it would be, what is a site remediation? And you should give me like 10% of that, you know what I mean? If you hit on that one, it should be. So site remediation is what you call a cleanup. That's the fancy word for it, And I think we should be fancy, so that's what it's called. But when you're talking about cleanups where there's been, where they're building houses, a lot of times there's dirty dirt still there. A lot of times there's still contaminants in their backyard, in the garden that they're going to be putting their tomato plants, in the soils that the little kids are going to play, the toddlers are going to play, that are not zero. that are elevated. But they're above a certain level. You need to know that, seems to me, when you're doing an appraisal, right? You need to know that. I think you need to take that into account.